Right, realms unreal. This is the last question, by the way. I know, of course, these these are there is an ubiquitous Celtic style in your illustration, but I know it's in Song of the Sea illustration. The rendering of the waves reminds me of Japanese art. Do you draw influences from any other cultures? Guess we can both answer that to finish up. Yes, of course. I mean, I've been looking at Japanese animation right from the beginning of my career. I think you maybe saw some of the Hokusai wave influence in Song of the Sea. Loved Hokusai's prints as a student. Definitely look to the one thing I learned when I first delved into both the folklore and the art style is how similar they are to other cultures around the world. And so I've always loved Eastern European and Russian animation just as much as Western American animation. And then some of the American animation or British animation that I loved growing up, I've learned it, took its inspiration in turn from earlier art forms internationally. So I definitely think we look not just in the quote unquote Celtic art, but to art history in general. How do you feel?
Yeah, well, um, this is, I mean, I feel like I could write a book about this question. um, Let me try and put it simply. There are things in art making where I'm looking specifically at things that I consider to be my own heritage. So um, I'm Canadian, but I'm also British. I was born in England. And when I look to use is the wrong word, but to make things from out of folklore, I don't look to Canadian ancient folklore because I don't feel like it's my heritage. Um, I do look to the British Isles, even though I didn't grow up there. But that's when it's about stories and when it's about ideas. When it comes to making pictures, when it comes to how the picture plane works, I don't draw any distinctions. To a certain extent, I consider all, illustrators, drafts people, drawers of stuff, painters. That's in a certain way, that's one culture. And when
Hmm.
it comes to Japanese art specifically, there's a lot of different things that I resonate with in terms of, classical, what I would call classical Japanese illustration, the wood blocks, all of that stuff. There's a number of things that I love about it. One of the things that I love about it is what I once called graphic shorthands for elemental forces, which is basically things like water, wind, rain. Um, they've found within that tradition, there are these amazing graphic reductions or abstractions of these undrawable elemental powers. And water is one of those. And it's not just, it's not just Hokusai. There's loads of other Japanese artists who have a broadly similar approach to dealing with water. And you can look to, you can look to Canaletto and the way he painted water. It's basically just blue with little white lines on it. You can look at Da Vinci in some of his sketches. He's studying how water flows, and it's these very hairy kind of lines. And water's not going to allow itself to be really captured, and you have to find your way of doing it. And I love the way that the Japanese tradition has solved a lot of those problems. So that's one of the places that I draw from. And I know in my poster, it's very Japanese looking in
Yeah,
the waves
yeah.
for sure.
Yeah, it's beautiful. I love it. And I think that's the thing to talk about and to have at the forefront of our mind when we talk about these notions of cultural appropriation, which obviously is awful. And, even in my own career, I wanted to make, the Irish fairy tale movie before Disney or someone did. That
Right.
said, I do think the history of art is maybe cultural appreciation. Like I was recently in the Netherlands and I went to the Delft Museum. My wife is a ceramicist, and it was fascinating to see that what we consider Delft pottery began as Dutch potters admiring Chinese porcelain and trying to mimic it, down to painting Chinese scenes on the porcelain.
Sure.
Then they
Yeah.
started to paint Dutch scenes on the porcelain in the Chinese style. Then the Chinese
Yeah.
people, artisans who'd never met these Dutch artisans, because this was at a time of international trade, but not a huge amount of
Mhm.
individual migration. They would see these Dutch porcelain pieces come back to China, and then they would go, "This is great," and they would start painting Dutch scenes like Amsterdam in China on the. And
Yep.
to me, that's cultural appreciation. That's artists taking and borrowing and looking at each other's work. And similarly,
Yeah.
Japanese prints arrived into Europe in the 1800s, and suddenly wallpaper designers and different people were looking at them and taking inspiration. I think it's about respect and appreciation and admiration rather than stealing or trying to pretend it's
Sure.
yours when it's
Sure.
not. Being
Yeah.
open to where you're taking it from. And I think it's totally that's the language of culture. Like everything is appropriation in a certain way. It's just about the attitude towards it, and it's not mocking or disrespectful,
Right.
but rather out of respect and appreciation. I think we can all continue to learn from each other's cultures without feeling defensive of it.
Yeah, and that encounter of Europeans at the turn of the previous century with Japanese and Chinese artwork. I'm that bred most of the art that I'm most influenced by. People often see the Japanese influence in my stuff, but the stuff that's more directly forefront of my mind influencing me, they tend to be European artists of that period. But what those European artists of that period were doing is what you and I talked about before, which is taking the Western rules of art and having them be reintroduced to graphic art.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and it was the East that did that for the Europeans, and they started combining these two things together. And that's what I love the most
Yeah.
is both of these things. Like I've never wanted to make my stuff be a copy of Japanese art. But there's all of this graphic stuff that lessons taught to me by looking at Japanese work and European work influenced by Japanese work. And yeah,
Yeah.
so that's, but when it comes to storytelling, when it comes to that sort of stuff, which characters I use,
Mm.
that's something where, at least for me, like I don't have political judgments for other people, how they choose to do it. But for me, um, I for a lot of reasons, right? A lot of very personal reasons to do with the way that my life has gone. I look at stuff that I feel is connected to,
Mm.
the land I was born
And
on.
what's awesome is you're looking at it not as someone who grew up in Britain, so you're bringing a different perspective to it, and I think it's
Right.
equally valid. Like, in just as much as I love your interpretation of our characters, because you're seeing it through a different lens, I think it's also really interesting whenever people from other cultures, it's fascinating to see. I would love to see, a Native American artist tell a Japanese folklore story. What would that look like? What would they bring? How would they add to that? So I think it's fascinating.